In September of 1991, German tourists Helmut and Erika Simon were hiking together through the Otztal Alps when they spotted something eerie in the distance. As they hiked closer to investigate, they were horrified to discover that it was a dead body sticking out of the snow. Though initially they assumed it was the frozen corpse of a dead hiker, the truth was even creepier. Upon retrieval by law enforcement, the body was identified as the victim of a 4,000-year-old unsolved murder and the possible subject of a deadly curse. This is the story of Otzi, the cursed ice mummy. You've heard of cold cases before, but no case is quite as cold as this one. Once Otzi, so named because of the Otztal region he was discovered in, was extracted from the glacier, it became apparent to authorities that this was not the body of a recently deceased hiker. For starters, the thousands of years he'd been stuck in the glacier had left him in a mummified state, and his body was desiccated but perfectly preserved. On top of that, he clearly wasn't wearing the latest hiking gear. Instead, he was wearing a cloak woven from grass over leggings, a coat, a loincloth, and shoes, all made from animal hide stitched together with sinew. It was immediately apparent that Otzi had been up there for a long time. After a brief border dispute over whether or not the territory of the mummy occurred in Austria or Italy, it was determined that Otzi was the property of the northern Italian province of South Tyrol. But the local government agreed to lend him to the Innsbruck University, a college in neighboring Austria, so he could be properly examined. This could have been one of the most important archaeological finds in Innsbruck history, but the magnitude of the discovery was soon overshadowed by something even stranger, the deadly curse that Otzi appeared to have brought down from the mountain with him. The first death attributed to the curse of Otzi was that of Rainer Henn, a forensic pathologist at Innsbruck University. Henn was part of the original team that removed Otzi from the ice. He was also one of the first people to ever touch the corpse, as he was the one who prepared it for removal. Henn died in a car crash in 1992. Ominously, it was while he was on his way to give a lecture about Otzi. Not long after this first death was the death of Kurt Fritz, who had led the search team to find the body following Helmut and Erika Simon's initial police report. While working with airplane search and rescue, Fritz's unit was caught in an avalanche. The rest of the team survived, but Fritz was tragically killed. Next, the cameraman who filmed the removal of Otzi from the ice for part of a documentary, Rainer Holz, was diagnosed with a brain tumor that would turn out to be fatal not too long after the documentary was made. And the deaths and misfortune wouldn't stop there. Could anything about Otzi's life tell us about why his body seems to carry such terrible luck with it? Who was Otzi the Iceman, really? Thankfully, the extensive autopsies and x-rays conducted by the scientists at Innsbruck University have given us a pretty clear picture of the man Otzi was before he became an ice mummy. He was 160 centimeters tall, or about 5'3", and though his freeze-dried corpse only weighed about 30 kilograms, scientists have estimated that he probably weighed about 50 kilograms or 110 pounds when he was alive. That might sound short by today's standards, but was probably average height for a Neolithic man. Skeletal analysis shows us that he was probably about 45 years old at the time of his death, and in the time since his discovery back in the 90s, 3D scanning and forensic reconstruction technology has allowed archaeologists to reconstruct what his face might have looked like. The reconstruction gave him a beard, deep-set brown eyes, and a weathered face that made him look very old for 45. To be fair, life was much harder back then, so that was probably a very accurate decision. Otzi was also covered in tattoos, 61 of them to be precise. Otzi's tattoos were mostly made up of sets of parallel lines in varying thicknesses, tattooed mainly running down his legs, though he has a few on his arms and back as well. He also has a cross tattooed on the back of his knee. The tattoos were done with what we would today refer to as stick and poke techniques, where pigment is rubbed into small punctures made through the top layer of skin. Microscopic analysis revealed that the pigment used to create Otzi's tattoos was likely made using fireplace soot, and the darkness and vibrance of the pigment suggests that Otzi likely had his ink touched up multiple times during his lifetime. At the time of his discovery, Otzi was the oldest mummy found to have tattoos, but in 2018, mummies with tattoos were found in Egypt that dated around the same time period. While you might assume that Otzi was tatted up for cultural or aesthetic reasons, the locations of his tattoos take on an interesting significance when compared to Otzi's X-rays. Examinations of the bones reveal a variety of age and stress-related skeletal conditions, such as osteochondrosis and spondylosis, particularly in the spine and leg bones. The skeletal damage lines up almost exactly with the locations of Otzi's largest clusters of tattoos, suggesting that the tattoos may have actually been a primitive form of acupuncture. In fact, at least 9 of Otzi's 19 clusters of tattoos correspond to pressure points that are still used in modern-day acupuncture and acupressure treatments. This was a mind-blowing find for archaeologists, as Otzi predates the earliest record of acupuncture use in China by about 2,000 years. The same X-rays that found Otzi's skeletal damage also found something a little more sinister, an arrowhead lodged in his left shoulder, which corresponded to a small rip in his jacket. The location of the arrow suggested a wound that would have been fatal even if Otzi had been able to access modern medicine. The arrow had shattered his scapula and caused severe damage to his nerves, lung, and blood vessels. Further analysis of Otzi showed that he had what seemed to be defensive wounds, bruises and cuts to his hands, chest, and wrists, and a deep cut to his thumb which happened so close to his time of death that no healing had occurred on it. There were also signs of cerebral trauma, indicative of a serious blow to the head. The most widely accepted theory is that Otzi died of blood loss and that based on his posture, his body was handled by someone else before rigor mortis had set in. Whoever killed Otzi flipped him onto his stomach in order to retrieve the shaft of the arrow, some broken remains of which were still found lodged in the wound. More recently, DNA analysis shows that Otzi had blood from at least 4 other people on him when he died. Blood from one person was found on his hunting knife, blood from another person was found on the shoulder of his coat, and blood from 2 people was found on a single one of his arrows. The interpretation of this evidence was that sometime before his death, Otzi stabbed one person, shot 2 people with the same arrow, and carried a 4th person over his shoulder, with the most common theory being that this 4th person was a fallen comrade. The 2 most common theories for why Otzi was killed are either that he was a human sacrifice, a theory supported by the discovery of similar wounds on bodies from the same time period found in peat bogs, such as Tolland Man and Lindau Man. Some have speculated that Otzi may have been a person of high status, likely a chieftain. The other theory is that he was murdered or possibly killed in a fight with whoever's blood was later found on his knife and arrows. Archaeologist Alessandro Vanzetti of Sapienza University, Rome, theorized that Otzi might have been killed at a lower altitude and his body brought to a higher altitude to be buried in the snow. Vanzetti and his colleagues believed this theory on a collection of stones found scattered near the body, which they interpreted as a burial mound that had been disrupted by centuries of glacial movement. However, this theory has been widely rebuked by other scientists who have studied Otzi, as the paper that introduced this theory provided no compelling evidence. Furthermore, as biological anthropologist Albert Zink argued, if Otzi's body had been moved up the mountain after his death, the intact blood clots found around his wounds would have shown damage resulting from the change in altitude. Regardless of whether he was killed on the mountain or killed somewhere else and dragged there afterwards, Otzi's death was violent, and it seems that his life was as well. This feels like a textbook case of a dark ritual and violent death, leading to a restless spirit stalking and punishing all those who disturbed its remains. Whether or not you're the superstitious type, the eeriness here is hard to deny, because after this the curse struck again. In 2004, the curse befell Helmut Simon himself, one of the original hikers to discover the body. At the time, Helmut was involved in a legal dispute over a finder's fee that he had been entitled by the Italian government following the discovery of Otzi. In 1994, the Simons had declined a symbolic payment of 10 million lira, valued at around 5,000 euro today, far less than the 25% finder's fee that the Simons were owed. In 2003, the Simons filed a lawsuit seeking equivalent to $300,000. This suit would never come to anything, however, because in 2004, Helmut Simon went missing while hiking the Gamskar-Kogel mountain range, also in Austria. When his body was eventually found, it was discovered that he had slipped and fallen to his death, landing in a pose that was eerily similar to that of Otzi. Bizarrely enough, the leader of the search party for Simon's body would go on to suffer a fatal heart attack on the same day as Simon's funeral. Since then, other scientists involved in studying Otzi have met tragic ends, mostly by illness. Konrad Spindler, part of the original team to analyze the mummy, died from complications related to multiple sclerosis. Ironically, Spindler was openly dismissive of the curse and frequently joked about being its next victim, since he had already been diagnosed with MS at the time of Otzi's discovery. This wasn't the case for Tom Loy, however. Loy was an American molecular archaeologist who was instrumental in analyzing the bloodstains on Otzi's clothes and weapons that we talked about earlier. He started working on Otzi in 1992. And during that same year, he would be diagnosed with a rare blood disease that would eventually kill him years later. Fortunately, the deaths caused by the curse of Otzi seem to have stopped there, since the majority of the hundreds of people who have handled the ice mummy over the years are still alive and well. Research into Otzi's life, his death, have continued up until the present day. So, despite his apparent efforts from beyond the grave to stop them, scientists have been able to uncover an insane level of detail about Otzi's life. For example, the axe he had on his person at the time of his death was analyzed and found to have a blade made of pure forged copper. Despite the fact that copper was being mined in the Alps at the time Otzi would have lived, molecular analysis proved that the copper wasn't from any local source. In fact, it came all the way from Tuscany. The blade shows clear signs of wear, and its presence among Otzi's possessions supports the theory that he was a chief or other high-class individual, as this axe would have been a very valuable possession. Otzi also had a few health problems he was dealing with at the time of his death. For example, he was suffering from whipworm, a type of intestinal parasite. This adds some context to another one of Otzi's possessions, a birch basket containing berries and 2 species of fungus that he'd apparently foraged that day. One type of fungus, tinder fungus, was probably used to light fires, while the other, birch fungus, was edible and has been known to be used as a treatment for parasites like the ones found inside of Otzi. On top of worms, Otzi is also considered to be the oldest recorded person to have suffered from Lyme disease, as the bacteria known to cause it was found in his system while scientists were sequencing his DNA. And speaking of DNA, Otzi's genome has been fully sequenced and the data was officially published in 2012. His Y chromosome DNA possessed a gene known as GL91, a gene that is today mostly found in the region of South Corsica. When Otzi's DNA was compared against the DNA taken from samples of 3,700 blood donors, it was found that Otzi shared a common ancestor with 19 of those donors. Those 19 people all share the GL91 mutation, a gene that can be traced back to the ancient Middle East and is associated with agriculture, as it's thought to have spread to European populations through a northern migration of tribes who brought their farming practices with them to Europe. So while his body may or may not have a curse placed on it, a claim which scientists can neither prove nor disprove, for now, there's no doubt that Otzi the Ice Mummy was a truly fascinating guy. But personally, we'd like to leave the handling of his body to other people, just to be safe. Now check out The Deadly Curse of the Billionaire Family and Real Creepy Cursed Objects for more cursed facts.